Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our day 3 of Global Energy Justice Action Week, JJL 2025. I'm Lynn from the Geography Department based at the University of Manchester. So just a quick note, this webinar session is being recorded for knowledge exchange, and you can also access it later if needed. So thank you for your understanding. And before we start, I would like to briefly introduce this webinar series, this event, especially to those who are new to this event. So let me share my screen now. Okay. Okay. Give me 1 second. This Global Energy Justice Action Week event is following the traditions of International Energy Poverty Action Week 2022 and 2023, which Mano mainly led the organization of. And huge thanks to Mano. And this year we are back with the renewed theme, Global Energy Justice Action Week. And we have different themes for 5 days during the whole week. In the past 2 days, we explored the energy justice around terminology and structural barriers. Today, we're going to explore everything around global north. And this event is mainly supported by the Generator project based at the University of Manchester. And we have an amazing team of collaborators from all over the world, and which you can see here. Thank you to all of you. Also, thanks to our 30 invited guest speakers from all over the world. Without you, this event would not gonna be happen. So, and finally, thank you for all the participants to join us. And we hope you enjoy the event and foster our discussions and conversations around energy justice. So I'm going to stop here and hand over to our today's chair, Dora. Dora, you might want to introduce yourself. So now I'm hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Dora Biondani from Climate Alliance and coordinating the Energy Poverty Advisory Hub. I've been attending also the previous Energy Poverty Actions Week under Manon, so I'm very happy that this year it got renewed. I will just give a quick introduction. So, as Lynn was saying, in the past 2 days, thanks to this event, so we traveled quite widely. We had the chance to explore different types of inequality and access. Yesterday, we explored the human side of energy injustice in places where the communities face the sharpest pressures. So the session always reminds us that the energy is never just a technical issue. It shapes also other elements like comfort, safety, dignity, and the rhythms of everyday life. Getting back to what it is today we will focus on something that maybe it's a little bit quieter, but for this reason, no less important. Today we focus on the global north, and when we think about the global north, maybe we have more pictures of stability, of universal access. However, this is not always the case. There are still invisible forms of energy hardship that can be found, in example, on parents that keep the homes not heated properly because the budget does not allow it. It can be seen maybe in migrant families that are navigating complex rental rules in a new country with a new environment. It may be reflected in older people that feel the summer heat more intensely every year, and they're facing difficulties to cope or to pay for conditioning or having a colder area. These are experiences that not often appears in the mainstream news, or that make, let's say, up to the mainstream cases, but still they shapes our life, and they are really real. They're in everyday moments we can see in different countries in the global north. So today I found it very powerful that we take the time to pause a little bit and reflect on this topic, and go deeper, go closely, try to put ourselves in the position of someone that from outside may be seen privileged, but where there are still a lot of inequalities to be addressed. And I'm very happy I have with me today 5 excellent speakers we will discuss about these questions. They will all bring different lenses, so from the research to policy to experience on the communities. So together we will try to have a map of this blind spot and think where we can be more attentive, where we can put people at the center of the discussion, and how we can help them. Some technical elements. Each speaker will talk for around 20 minutes, and they will be one after the other. So we will gather all your questions and reply it at the end. So feel free to write in the chat or on the question and answer sections. And then in the moment it pops in your mind, and then we will address it at the end. And I will say that we can start because the agenda is quite packed. And I will start with Dr. Anna Stozilovska. I hope I pronounced it well. I try as much as possible to ask our speaker to give me one sentence that I wanted for today. She's a social scientist that's exploring energy poverty, energy justice, and inequalities. And the quote she decided for today, it was to say in a sentence that energy injustice is recognizing and addressing the drivers of societal inequality that prevent all individuals from accessing and enjoying essential services. And with this sentence, I give the voice to you, Anna, to start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen, and with that, my presentation. Okay. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present, and I would like to share a little bit of piece of ongoing research that focuses on Hungary. I think a really good example of hidden energy injustices in the global north, and this is part of my project called Hungary in the Energy Crisis, and funded by a National Research Development and Innovation Office. So first, when we talk about energy poverty or energy vulnerability, we always focus on the household. However, can we actually imagine that one key aspect of energy vulnerability, or that thermal discomfort, and we'll relate it with that, this inability or being entrapped in a situation where you cannot really deal with the factors that put you in this situation, especially having these health impacts that that are results from thermal discomfort, or one aspect of energy poverty. Can we actually experience this outside of the home? Can this still be energy poverty or not? So I was inspired by the recent events in Hungary as a result of the energy crisis that started from the Russian invasion in Ukraine and kind of affected whole Europe. And we can actually slowly see that as a result of some policy changes, which I'll mention, but also kind of this external pressures of the energy crisis, we could see that also some other spaces beyond home were significantly affected. One example was that in the independent media reported that some hospitals actually were, so in this case, this is an example of part of the hospital that didn't have heating for 2 weeks. So we can think about hospital as a public space where there are employees, but also patients, visitors as well, especially the patients spend essential time there. Then on the other hand, this is an example of in the public university of Elte, which is the largest public university in Hungary, that actually students had to take an exam, which is you have to sit there for several hours. Here, I think I can read 6 or 7 degrees. So this was in the winter. So also another university example of a public space that actually had really definitely a very big thermal discomfort, and students and also professors had to be there for ongoing activities. And on the other hand, in the summer, there was also a lot of discussion because Hungary is part of this Eastern Europe that really in the recent years have been affecting the heat wave, something that wasn't typical for this region. And it's an example of journalistic research of going through several public transport options in Budapest to actually measure the temperature. And this was, I think, in Metro 3, where it was like 34.6 degrees. So this is also some kind of a space that you spend maybe some time when you commute, and it is also has been really affected by the heat. So we can actually see that definitely the energy crisis was here as a factor, but also what was really interesting about Hungary is that while all other countries, usually in Europe, were taking some kind of a measures to really help mitigate the effects of increasing energy prices, what happened in Hungary that the utility reduction program, which is not by far not really a perfect or any good program, has been really criticized a lot, but it was a way of having a cap on the electricity and gas prices for a certain for users, so which was actually reduced, so that actually only if you are really small users for certain households now you would be below and your price would be still subsidized. But as a effect, this actually had a huge impact on bills that very big institutions used to pay, like hospitals, universities, and some of their bills actually increased overnight by 7 times. So this was like a huge shock midst of a crisis to big public institutions. And then actually this, because we kind of can observe that this is a really interesting new phenomenon. And my question is, can we actually think about this as expanding the vulnerability to new spaces, especially public spaces, and actually to people, like people who spend time in these places, either as employees or users of these spaces. So going forward, we really did first a survey to ask about the lived experiences. Has anybody actually experienced being too hot in summer or too cold during the heating season at work, in other places of when they receive public services or maybe leisure, like in coffee or going to a hair salon or in the public transport. And these were the results. And it was very interesting to see that here that definitely they were, and also as a kind of reference point, we also asked about this typical aspect of energy poverty, whether there was these thermal discomforts in summer and winter at home. And we can see that experiencing thermal discomfort at work was actually more frequent, was a bigger phenomenon than actually being at home. And definitely summer versus winter, so the summer discomfort was much higher. And even especially in also public transport, this was something that being very uncomfortably warm in during while using public transport was a big phenomenon. And it was very interesting, so that we can kind of slowly see that okay, so people who were maybe who have never experienced this phenomenon at home, who were really not in any classical form of energy poverty, now actually had to experience this at work. And on the other hand, we have people who had this experiencing this energy vulnerability, but now they had another space where they would go to work or public transport, that now they were actually exposed to this. So expanding the kind of the space of vulnerability. And it's interesting about the gender education of survey participants. So they were mostly women. Of course, this was not a representative survey, but actually by having more women respond to this, we kind of assume that it's probably where women more or less were affected by this. So this is like one assumption that we're exploring. Further on, we know that women are more sensitive to temperature change, but it was also very interesting whether maybe they are also working in more kind of public sector jobs that maybe were the ones who were more affected by this situation. And also about the education, it's very interesting to see that actually these people, like most of the respondents, had a higher education. So they are not really vulnerable. They are not really low income or like in any kind of a classical vulnerability. So we can really, again, think about whether this phenomenon had really expanded really the space and the scope of people who is actually affecting. Because this is also numbers, right? We maybe do not get the same really get like the depthness of the problem. We ask also a bit more questions, and we can actually see that there was also some very interesting statements about the about how they felt in this situation. And this is a woman, 62-year-old woman who disclosed illness or disability, and actually she was experienced cold at work, and she kind of said that she got ill because of this being actually exposed to the cold at work. Going further on in being too hot at work, there was also another example, and this is a woman working in a medical facility that actually she was explaining how there is no air conditioning at work, and actually she's been there in a very warm atmosphere. And this is also her as an employee, but also there is, of course, the users that the patients that come, and she also explained this as something that affects you mentally and physically. And then there was also very interesting thing about a kind of a going asking a little bit deeper about this, that some of them actually face some kind of a legal entrapment or some kind of a legal restrictions, legal or restrictions by their superiors. So for example, in this case, in a situation of cold at work, this woman was forbidden to use a heat lamp, but at the same time there was also these ideas of resistance, that they find a way that they somehow secretly used it, because, and we can really a little bit think about these coping strategies and adaptive capacities that we usually hear about households, how they somehow manage this. So this was very interesting. And also again in a situation of being too hot at work, that also another woman was saying that there was a bit of a conflict with the management and kind of this power imbalance between the employees and the bosses, this kind of a level of management, and that also kind of a disagreement, or that feeling that they have not really been protected from this situation, and that the management really doesn't care about the situation. And then going interesting a bit more, focusing on the public services, we can really see that this is also has been kind of a little bit of, we can experience, we can observe this deterioration, reduction of quality of public services. So this example shows that a 59-year-old woman, she also tried to avoid going into a hospital during the summer because it was uncomfortably warm, but sometimes she cannot really influence when this appointment would be at, because this has health implications. She actually had to go, and there was also other examples that, for example, some, if they can, they would go in a private healthcare, but it was not always an option for everybody to afford private healthcare. And again, this is also being the experience of being too hot in the public transport. And also the descriptions that we can see from this example is that definitely it is about this kind of a technical side of really old trains that supposed to have air conditioning, there is not working. Then actually you cannot open the windows because still the air conditioning has to work. And in the end of the day, we see at the kind of her conclusion, we see that it is about that elderly people avoid traveling using public transport in the summer, which is some form of social exclusion, if we actually might state that. And then these are my preliminary conclusions. We are now analyzing our interviews, which we went a little bit deep into how this have happened, but these are just some food of thought, and I'm happy to discuss this in the discussion. So while we actually seen that previously these third spaces of public spaces have been some kind of a safe haven from cold home or a too hot home, what if we talk about that some of these third spaces, can they suffer from energy poverty? Can we actually call this phenomenon energy poverty? So we know that previously there's been, the research is still ongoing about, right, energy efficiency of this whole building sector, non-residential sector, but can we actually talk about this, or can we call this some kind of a form of energy poverty? And then also I kind of try to define this as socioeconomic and spatial phenomenon or a non-residential energy poverty. And also, this was very interesting for me how we've seen this expansion over space and people. So we have the people who've been vulnerable at home. They now have new places they're vulnerable to, like at home or in public transport or going to the hospital, or people who have never experienced this, now they're actually facing these challenges. And it is also like, when we talk about new types of vulnerability, new types of vulnerable groups. And for me, this was so far struck the employees who are working in these sectors. They're often female. Some of them actually have illness or disability. And maybe these are like a new category of persons who are affected by energy poverty outside of the home. And also, on the other hand, on the other side, also focus on public spaces, especially medical facilities, schools, universities, public transport, as actually these new vulnerable places. Then definitely what I dare to call this some form of energy poverty is that the feeling of entrapment, this even resistance or coping strategy or trying to really find your way or your comfort or your survival in this very limited legal or technical environment was actually what struck me the most, that this could be something that I dare call it non-residential energy poverty. And lastly, to put a little bit of more context, so this is what we're exploring. So, and I wonder whether this has happened in other European countries, because for Hungary was, of course, these external factors of summer energy poverty being a new phenomenon, but at the same time also the energy crisis, which we know affected the whole of Europe globally, but also the kind of this authoritarian illiberal democracy context where we also have deteriorating quality of public services and also poor decision making. Even the Rezsicsökkentés, the utility program, wasn't the best policy ever, but it was cut in the midst of a crisis, leaving like all these new sectors unaccounted for in a very deprived situation. So thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Very, very interesting this analysis of what it is, not the household energy poverty, but other contexts that still constitute a lot of time in our daily life. We will have time to discuss it further at the end, as said, and now I leave the word to the next speaker, that is Manon Burbidge. She's one of the pillars behind the Energy Poverty Action Week, as we said, and currently she will guide us through a discussion exploring the refugee experiences of hidden energy depredation in the Greater Manchester area in the UK. Manon, to you for proceeding with your presentation.
Thank you, Dora. All right. Please let me know if you can see this in full screen. Is that okay?
Actually, we see the presentation mode with the next slide nearby.
Anyone got any ideas how to fix it?
If you're using two screens, you need to switch the screens.
I'm not. I'll try again.
Yeah.
No?
Now it looks fine. Yes.
Yeah, looks good. Okay, perfect. All right. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties, even after 5 years on Zoom. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this session today. My name's Manuel Burbage, and I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Manchester. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about refugees' lived experiences of energy deprivation in Greater Manchester in the context of today's theme, which is hidden hardships and policy blind spots. This research is a section of my wider PhD, which is investigating the drivers and experiences of energy deprivation among refugees in England more broadly, using a multi-method participatory approach across 3 case study sites. I think it's really important to introduce this research with a quick overview of the UK's asylum system for those who aren't familiar with it, as it contextualises the results that I'll share later on. So to clarify the terms refugee and asylum seeker, in this presentation, I will use the UK legal definitions, so that an asylum seeker is somebody who's claimed asylum in the UK and is waiting on a decision, whilst a refugee is somebody that has received a positive decision on their asylum claim and therefore has leave to remain in the UK. It's also important to stress that refugees in the UK are an extremely diverse group of people from a range of ethnicities, nationalities, and walks of life. So whilst people are in the asylum system and waiting for that decision on their claim, if they present as destitute, they're entitled to receive state support. However, receiving that state support is highly conditional. So that means people are subject to living in what's called no choice dispersal accommodation. Often that's hotels and hostels anywhere in the country, and they have no choice over where they live. They can also be moved at extremely short notice, sometimes with as little as 24 hours notice, and have very few tenancy rights. If they refuse to be moved or refuse accommodation, then their financial support can be stopped. If people live in catered accommodation, people receive just £8.86, so that's about €10 per week, or £40, about €40 if they are living in non-catered accommodation. So housing costs and bills are paid for by the state, but that money has to cover transport, medicines, clothing, legal fees, basically anything else you can think of. So given that a bus fare in most towns and cities in the UK is £4, which is about €5, that money really doesn't stretch very far. People also aren't allowed to work whilst they're waiting for their asylum claim, so they also live on extremely low incomes. If people receive a positive decision on their asylum claim and become a refugee, they only have 28 days to leave their asylum accommodation before they're evicted. In that time, people have to open a bank account, apply for mainstream benefits, try to find a job and alternative housing. So unsurprisingly, it's a really key time of vulnerability for new refugees, with really high levels of homelessness and destitution recorded among this group of people. And the vulnerability that people experience is exacerbated by the fact that people receive very little information about housing options, despite secure housing being recognised as extremely important for refugee wellbeing and integration outcomes. And I found no evidence at all that any energy advice is disseminated by the state whilst people are living in the asylum system. This is all playing out amidst a backdrop of what's called the hostile environment against migrants, which is a deterrent strategy designed to make life as difficult as possible so that people elect to leave, and also to prevent new arrivals from coming in the first place. There's a backdrop of rising far-right sentiment, and also 15 years of austerity, which has seen widespread cuts to public services and shifting responsibility away from the state towards the voluntary sector, who are trying to fill the gaps in service provision with less funding and for more people. So I asked myself the question, do refugees experience energy poverty or do they experience energy deprivation? So I'm sure that most people here are familiar with the term energy poverty, which is a situation in which households are unable to access materially and socially essential energy services, and that's driven by low income, poor quality and efficient housing and high energy bills. However, there have been calls by academics to examine the underpinning institutional and systemic drivers that lead to that condition. So I drew together the results of my literature and policy review, the ethnographies that I carried out, and the interviews. And I've highlighted some of these underpinning drivers as they pertain to refugees in the UK after they leave the asylum system. These drivers are typically linked to broader processes of welfare and asylum provision that leave refugees disproportionately vulnerable to the triad of factors that lead to the energy poverty, which I've grouped. Apologies for the colour scheme. So, for example, since people are unable to work when they're in the asylum system and due to language barriers, it can be very difficult to secure employment once they receive refugee status. And the low amount of financial support given to people in the system means they're unable to save. So that increases the likelihood of new refugees being on a low income and in low paid precarious work. The national shortage of social housing means that only the most vulnerable people and families are able to secure accommodation in the sector. And low income means that people are more likely to be forced to rent cheap housing that's of poor quality or informally rent, so leading to exploitation, overcrowding, vulnerability to unscrupulous and illegal practices. New refugees are also exposed to high energy bills and energy debt due to unfamiliarity with UK energy systems, barriers to contacting suppliers due to language, and also digital literacy issues. So as we can see, refugees are systematically rendered vulnerable to situations of destitution by the experience of the asylum system. So therefore, I suggest that refugees in the UK suffer from energy deprivation rather than energy poverty, given that element of the denial of safe, affordable and adequate energy and their constrained access to housing and income that is created by the state. And despite those drivers I've identified, engagement with this issue is still really, really rare. And that's the case in policy, academia and the third sector in a global north context outside of camp-based scenarios. So energy deprivation amongst refugees in the UK can be described as hidden in that it's unrecognised by indicators, policies and political narratives, whilst refugees are underrepresented in decision-making spaces, which constitutes a form of recognitional energy injustice. So since those marginalising impacts of energy deprivation are often felt at the everyday level, in domestic settings, and therefore tend to go unseen or under the radar, how do we actually go about shedding light on that issue, which is so complex and also unrecognised? So a key part of my PhD was the use of the photo voice methodology. This is a creative visual participatory method which combines photography and dialogue and is recognised as a useful way to raise awareness with decision makers and to shed light on issues that are usually unseen. So I carried this out with 7 participants who were living in Greater Manchester in the autumn of 2024. And I undertook this with a refugee rights organisation in the city. And the participants were active in the research process at every stage. So together with participants, we co-produced the themes that they wanted to take their photographs on based on the challenges with energy that they were facing in their everyday lives. So we did like a sorting exercise, which you can see in the photo on the right. And 4 of the themes that we came up with were issues with bills, energy and health, uncertainty, fear and abandonment, and the impacts of damp and mould. When I got the photos back from participants, about 3/4 of the images that I received were of everyday, ordinary energy using appliances and devices. And although these seemed pretty mundane and ordinary, the elicitation discussions revealed that there were, in fact, rich stories and lived experiences hidden behind those everyday items, which might otherwise have gone unnoticed. So the first theme was issues with bills. All but one of the participants struggled with the high cost of energy bills, generally making ends meet and feeling warm enough at home. which had worsened with the cost of living crisis, which was going on in the UK at the time. Low mood, anxiety, and hypervigilance around bills and their energy use as a result of that cost were frequently raised along photos of household appliances, such as the shower in this photo, which the participants were representative of the trade-offs that they had to make when navigating daily lives on a low income. As Boris explains to us in this quote, he needs to wash quickly. It's a bit of paranoia. Nothing is relaxing, the problem it will create for the bills. The second theme, which is around energy and health. Photos of meters and radiators, like the photo that's on the screen, often revealed the complex negotiations that participants had to undertake to maintain their physical and their mental health, managing existing conditions, and being able to pay their heating bills. So this participant, Abdullah, suffers from multiple physical health issues, including post-polio syndrome, which makes him highly susceptible to catching pneumonia. So his doctors told him he has to keep the heating on all the time to avoid getting cold, which means that he has to very carefully manage the rest of his money to make sure that he doesn't go hungry, as he explains in his quote. The third theme was around uncertainty, fear, and abandonment. And energy issues and financial constraints affected participants to such an extent that it was perceived to diminish their quality of life, damage their social relationships, and their ability to exert agency and control over their lives. This is exemplified in this photo. So this is a photo, British Gas is an energy supplier, British energy supplier, coming through her letterbox. And she tells me that her desire for peace in her home is ruptured daily by the arrival of letters, among which may be a bill that she's unable to pay due to the high cost of energy and her low income, leaving her unable to feel properly at home. As she says, her house should be a place for peace, but fear follows her in the home. The fourth theme was around damp and mould. So this is a photo of a pair of boots that have gone mouldy from just being in a house which has really, really bad damp and mould. Many participants described how the presence of mould in their homes created additional burdens of care and domestic labour for them, necessitating often daily cleaning, the reorganisation of their living spaces to prevent illness and so that possessions didn't become unusable, as well as stringent ventilation routines to reduce the indoor humidity. So Rafia recounted to me alongside this photo of her son's shoes about how living in her house induces a sense of total hopelessness. She feels completely unable to do anything since her housing association won't take any action because they decided that the issue was caused by her and her son breathing. So through the photos, we can see how, as a result of living on pervasive low income and in damp and mouldy homes, energy using appliances are the material embodiments of negotiations, trade-offs, and coping strategies that people are forced to employ to meet their daily needs, to the extent that energy becomes a feared practice. We can also see that living in situations of energy deprivation generates a sense of insecurity, a lack of agency over the home space, really poor mental well-being, and a disrupted sense of everydayness. So in the terms of their routines and their homemaking practices, which in turn alters people's ability to create and maintain a sense of normality. As I mentioned before, participants describe cutting off social networks. They prioritise their children's needs over their own. For example, skipping meals or living in the cold whilst their children are at school, so they had enough money to put the heating on when the children came home. Being unable to afford the energy needed to cook traditional cultural foods, which particularly for the African participants, they mentioned that foods take a long time to cook. So they had to cut out sort of their links to being back home, and also constricting their use of home spaces. So shutting off certain rooms in the house to be able to afford to warm just the one room where the family ended up living. So linking back to the identified importance of housing for refugee resettlement and integration, each of my participants were actually living in social housing, which offers relative stability compared with the private rental sector. Yet even so, they really struggled to still feel secure as a result of their enduring experiences of trauma from their migration journeys, poverty, anxiety, and disrupted homemaking practices. This shows how feeling at home extends far beyond the provision of housing alone. So not just the physical structure of four walls and a roof, but how living without adequate energy inside the house really fractures the ability for people to feel properly at home. This sort of unsettled state of being can also arise as a result of trauma inflicted by, like I said before, people's migration journeys, but also their experiences of living in the asylum system, and really highlights the long reach of the state into refugees' lives after they've obtained leave to remain. So in summary, through state-induced denial of safe, affordable and adequate access to energy in their homes, refugees are consequently denied the ability to conduct homemaking practices, carry out everyday routines and maintain the caring relationships that they need to be able to properly remake home in the UK. To finish on a slightly more positive note, I've tried to highlight how we can move beyond the policy blind spot. So there are a few policy implications that we can draw out from the work. So I'll just highlight a couple of these. Firstly, policy needs to recognise how intersecting vulnerability impacts experiences of energy deprivation. So, for example, people with a refugee or migration background and how that experience actually leads to specific needs around energy. Policy needs to integrate the voices of underheard, underrepresented groups in a participatory and collaborative manner. For example, by those participants in my study foregrounding the issues that they wanted to take photos of, we were able to see the hardships that they experienced in their lives, not just answering questions that a researcher has predetermined. Energy advice needs to be systematically embedded into move-on support that's provided by the state and local authorities. And also increased responsibility should be placed on energy companies to proactively reach out to customers with accounts in arrears, to provide interpreters for phone lines, bill translations, and also to train customer support workers in sort of trauma and culturally informed practice. If anyone has any questions, I'd love to take them at the end. It's my contact information and also some of the references that inspired some of my thinking. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Manon. Very interesting. There was a word that today I'm hearing a lot. This morning we had also at EPA the practitioner events, and I heard a lot of talking about fear, but it's also mentioned in your presentation. It is the fear of receiving letters and everything. So, and I can only imagine for someone new in a country where still struggling maybe with the language, how it can feel to receive an official letter in the post. And I laugh because even my parents recently, they told me now when the bell rings and it's someone asking me to sign for the post, I'm starting to be afraid because it's always bad news or something that you have. So I think it's a much reflected feelings that it is fear of not being able to fulfill what it is. Very interesting. Let's move on with the next speaker. We are more or less on time, I think. The next speaker is Anna Bayomi. She's the Energy Poverty Policy Officer at FEANSA, and her quote is focusing on the poor. So currently, the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. But when unfit homes get fixed first, when no one gets sick from the place they sleep, when firewood users are recognized, when clean energy shines for all and not just for the privileged few, that's when the European Union will deliver its promise of leaving no one behind. Very strong sentence with very high objectives. I let it to you, Anna, to start your presentation and guide us through your reasoning.
Thank you very much, and I will share my presentation. I hope the full screen mode will also work. Yes, I hope you see fine my screen. So I work as Energy Poverty Policy Officer at FEANSA, which is the Federation of
Anna,
Homeless Service Providers.
Anna,
in Europe, so
Anna.
mostly my organization is focusing on EU policy to improve
Sorry, Anna.
and to end homelessness in
Anna.
Europe. And within that work, a few years ago, we started to focus on the situation of people living in unfit homes and to see how the
Anna,
policies could
Anna,
improve living conditions of badly housed people through building renovation policies and how to protect vulnerable groups from unintended negative consequences of the transition, such as displacement, higher rents, and so on.
Anna.
And so in terms of energy poverty, even if Europe is a wealthy part of the globe, we still see that millions are impacted by energy poverty.
Lynn, can you try to mute her so she does not?
Housing stock, rising prices of energy and other basic
I just tried to message her.
services, and also the climate transition has also costs that arrives to the
If you mute her, she should hear us. Anna, can you hear us? We mute you because we cannot see and you cannot hear us. You kicked her out completely. No, it's here.
I try to, unmute her.
Can
Hi,
you hear
Anna,
us?
sorry. Yeah, we just can't see your screen and oh my God.
Okay, while we try to solve these issues with Anna, let's move to the next speaker, and you, Lina, you can discuss with her.
I try to message her again.
I hope, Sergio, you're ready to jump in earlier. So Sergio Tirado Herrero is a senior researcher, fellow and lecturer for the Department of Geography in the Autonomous University of Madrid. He will guide us through hidden energy poverty and the precarious access to energy in Europe.
There was
Can you hear us now?
Audio.
No, she cannot hear us. Lena, I think it's the same. She cannot hear us.
Okay, now I can hear.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. Apologies. Just in a second, I saw that I've been muted, and then Okay.
We were trying to talk to you, but you could not hear us because we can still not see the presentation even now. So if you are sharing, it's not working.
Okay.
I don't know if you shared it with Lynn. Maybe Lynn can try to share her screen. No, now it's happening.
Give it a
something.
try. Yeah.
Now it's working.
Now we can see your screen now. Yeah.
Okay. Apologies.
Maybe
so you
expand.
haven't seen and heard anything that I've said so far, basically. Okay. Sorry about that. That's very...
It's okay. Anna, can you expand your slides?
Yeah. I'm trying.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay,
Yeah,
I can see it and everything works. Okay. So, sorry. Then I start from scratch. I'm working as an energy poverty policy officer at FEANSA, which is the Federation of Homeless Service Providers in Europe, and we mostly work on homelessness. But a few years ago, we started to work as well on the unfit housing stock and how the EU green transition could provide support to vulnerable households to improve their housing conditions, and how also the unintended negative externalities of some green transition policies, such as related to displacement and rent increases, could be lowered and protect vulnerable households and then support them to reach better housing conditions through policies. So to highlight some key issues, even if Europe is among the most wealthiest parts of our globe, still tens of millions of households face energy poverty. And this is mostly related to poor housing conditions and increasing costs related to energy and other basic necessities. And the climate transition also has an additional impact on this related to energy costs and also the price of transitioning to clean technologies. While there has been a big step forward in mapping energy poverty in Europe, the data still is not perfectly representing all aspects of energy poverty. And while many households are already transitioning to heat pumps and clean technologies, still too many households are relying on dirty heating fuels such as coal, oil, and firewood across Europe, mostly for heating, but also in some parts for cooking. And often national policy assumes that people have the financial capacity to invest in the upgrades that they need. And while the leaving no one behind in the transition is often cited in European policies, and there has been some legislative element integrated into the EU energy transition framework. There are no strong legal guarantees that this will be really delivered. And while we talk a lot about building renovations, energy efficiency, and upgrading of the heating system, the size of the unfit housing stock in Europe is often ignored. Also, the territorial and economic inequalities in terms of, for example, capacity to invest in renovations is often underestimated, and especially in the capacity of households to finance these investments. And while the firewood and coal use is getting some attention, it is not yet recognized in many crucial EU-level policies, such as price monitoring systems and protection of vulnerable customers. And also the distribution of green policies is not included systematically in the system, and therefore it is really hard to assess to what extent the European Union is delivering on leaving no one behind. So in Europe, we have 15% of the population living in unfit homes, which is around 70 million people. And in some Eastern European countries, unfit housing is even a more severe problem. Like in Romania, almost 14% of households live in a home without shower, bath, or flushing toilet. And in Hungary, it's only 1% of the population that lives without basic amenities, but it adds up to 100,000 people altogether, which could be easily tackled, but still not in the center of the policies, like not even on the political agenda, and no support schemes to resolve these issues. And finally, the severe housing deprivation rate, which is overcrowdedness plus at least another housing difficulty like lack of basic amenities or leaking homes, impacts 4% of the population, 20 million households, and the share again in Central and Eastern European countries is higher, with almost 20% in Romania. And while it is a lot of household, but compared to the EU population is not such a big number. So if with a dedicated effort, these issues could be resolved. Then there are territorial inequalities. The work of Sergio, together with Stefan Buzarowski, mapped this territorial divide between the core and periphery of Europe, which is also represented by the EU energy poverty indicators were represented. That energy poverty is often a more severe problem in the peripheries. And however, these energy poverty indicators are mostly based on self-declaration, and there is not much energy poverty related indicator money collected at an EU level, which would be based on objective data, for example, on the number of disconnections or debt among households collected from utilities or energy regulators. And also this chart shows these territorial inequalities, that in lower income countries, people spend less on energy, but this smaller expenditure represent a higher share from their income. Two very maybe extreme examples is Denmark, with the highest energy expenditure of 3,000 euros, which represent around 10% from their income, while in Hungary people spend on average very little on energy, but this represents almost 15% from their income. And this is an average among low income households. And we also see that, for example, in Hungary, twice the median threshold, which is used for measuring energy poverty, is at 25%, while energy poverty thresholds in the UK or France are around 8 and 10% of energy expenditure. And as incomes in Central and Eastern Europe are lower, this higher share of energy expenditure from a smaller income leaves also less money for covering other basic necessities. And these very big income differences, threefold between the poorest and the highest income, the lowest income and the highest income country, also means that people has less income to cover additional investments that will be necessary for covering building renovation costs, which could be around from 20 to 66,000 euros if we talk about complex retrofits. And yearly median income in Hungary is 11,000 euros, so is at least minimum 2 years of income that is necessary to cover the renovation costs. And while there are renovation subsidies in place, these are often post reimbursed, like based on post reimbursement. So first, a household needs to invest the money in the renovation, and then they get the money back. And also the saving distribution is highly unequal, with most of the savings appearing at the highest income groups, while again, citing Hungary, the lowest income group has negative savings, meaning that they have more debt than savings on their bank account. And during our work at FEANSA, we collected some examples of where renovation funding is arriving. This is the case of Germany, where the uptake of single and complex renovation cost measures were in majority arriving to, well, maybe not in majority, but in the highest share to the high income group with an income above 5,000 euros, while poorest households benefited very little or not at all from this renovation support. The distribution of the Italian super bonus for renovation was also highly unequal, benefiting mostly regions like richer northern regions of Italy and flowing to higher income groups. And finally, this is a scheme from Austria for energy retrofits, where also the highest share of beneficiaries was among the highest income group. And also in Austria, there was a scheme for heating device renovation or replacement targeted especially to the lowest income groups, but it was a post-financing mechanism. So again, policymakers were assuming that lowest income households in Austria has all the money to buy a new heat pump and it's enough to reimburse them. And this chart explains that even in France, which is the most one of the most progressive countries in terms of providing higher renovation support to lower income households, even with the mix of national, local subsidies and loans, lowest income households still need to cover 10% of the total renovation cost, which could be around 6,600 euros. And as poor households do not have these savings, or even if they have these savings, these are usually very basic safety savings to cover unexpected expenses, so not necessarily dedicated to these kind of measures. This organization called Stop l'Exclusion Énergétique set up a fund to finance this remaining part of renovation costs in order to make renovations accessible for those that live in the worst performing buildings. And the European legislation also recognized this issue that the public money should ideally arrive to low-income households, because these are the ones that are not capable of accessing private finance or finance the renovations with their own means. And we have limited public money. Therefore, in the legislation already shows the direction by outlining that appropriate financing should be provided and the problem of upfront costs should be tackled. And it also suggests that member states shall consider whether to use revenue-based parameters or not, and that the finance should target in priority vulnerable households, which are all very straightforward and clear directions. However, there is no specific earmarking, or there is no indicator or target set next to these goals. So, for example, in the case of number 4, if a member state has considered the usage of revenue-based parameters and then finally decide to not use it and continue to distribute funding also to very affluent groups, then there is no space to then question why the funding is not arriving to where it should be. And also the prioritization of vulnerable households is not linked to a certain percentage. Therefore, at the implementation phase, it's really difficult to reach those targets. And often we hear that, but we have the Social Climate Fund in place, which was set up to mitigate the regressive impacts of the upcoming carbon pricing mechanism that will be extended to housing and transport, and which is the first EU fund that is socially targeted in terms of energy renovations. But if you look at the cost of renovation among low-income households in the periphery of Europe, it would cost like 140 billion, while the total size of the Social Climate Fund is only 86 billion euros. And it's not only supposed to cover renovation costs, but it is also targeted to transport support and support to cover increased energy bill and micro enterprises. So the budget is very crucial, and it's a good example of earmarked funding, but it's not enough. And in my work just the last year, I already seen so many ideas for new measures that could be financed from the Social Climate Fund, as if it would be an infinite funding spot, which is not true. Then another blind spot, and then I will be quick because probably I'm already over time because of the technical issues. So firewood use is very high among poor people at risk of poverty in Central and Eastern Europe, going up to 80% in Latvia and Lithuania. And it's also the major renewable energy source in heating, and also a major contributor to air pollution. And as renewable energy targets are mandatory for European member states, it's really it is a crucial contributor to reaching those renewable energy targets. And at the same time, the firewood burners are mostly from the lowest income groups, and they are not protected under vulnerable consumer protection measures. And also firewood prices has been dramatically increasing in the last, not only during the energy crisis, but even before. And firewood prices are not monitored as electricity and gas prices. Therefore, no policy responses were provided when prices spiked. And finally, in terms of another crucial aspect of the energy transition is electrification and demand-side flexibility in order to facilitate better the increased electricity consumption with the renewable energy sources. And with the demand-side flexibility measures, households that are fully electrified, if they use properly their smart meters and accordingly their other appliances, they can save a lot on their high electricity bill, while on the other hand, households that have no capacity to invest in these technologies, like solar panels, heat pumps, batteries, and electric cars, will be left out from this saving potential. And the research in Spain showed that taking into consideration financial and territorial capacities and probabilities, there is a tenfold difference between low-income and high-income households in different territories in terms of capacity to invest in flexibility measures. So maybe this was a bit too many different areas put together, but I just wanted to highlight that from renovating the worst performing buildings through the access to clean heating methodologies, arriving to new directions of flexibility and electrification. The guarantees are not yet there, even if the starting point is already in the directive, but more is needed to be done in order to guarantee that while we keep up with the climate goals, we also make sure that in the transition everyone can participate fully. So thank you for your attention, and I was also very happy to listen to the other presentations.
Thank you, Anna, for your contribution. For me, the main takeaway, as you said, you touched different topics, so it really gives an idea on how addressing energy poverty is really systemic. There were some graphs where you clearly encompass, like looking at one indicator or only one aspect of it can prevent us to actually spot where there are complex cases and vulnerabilities, like looking only at the energy prices without comparing with the income, or in other cases, looking at the price of energy, not considering that maybe someone moved to the firewood. So it really opens the concept to look in different directions. Let's now really move with Sergio Tirado Herrero, that is calling us from Spain. He's a senior researcher fellow and lecturer from the Department of Geography in the Autonomous University of Madrid. He says that energy justice is also about recognizing our own and other biases in how we think, speak, and respond to inequalities in energy access and energy use. And I'm aware that maybe in the word I said just before, Sergio, you spotted a lot of biases I may have. So I'm curious to see what it is your perspective and how can we improve ourselves in analyzing the wording we are using and the way we're thinking about it. Sergio, up to you. I think you can already share on top of what Anna has.
Thank you, Laura. Lynn. Okay, I'll see.
Sorry, Anna, maybe can you stop sharing now? Okay, great.
Okay.
Yes.
First of all, can you see my slides properly?
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me well?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, from Madrid. And thank you, Lynn and Dora, and the organizers of the Global Energy Justice Action Week. It's really great to be here. I mean, and it's great that this Global Energy Justice Action Week has happened again. And I remember when we did the first two editions back in 2022, 2023, I think it was. So it's great that it's happening again. Okay, speaking of biases, what I want to tell you about today with my presentation is a bit of my own trajectory as a researcher in energy poverty, in which I have been looking a lot into issues of energy affordability, domestic energy affordability, up until the point in which I slowly realized that even in a global north context, in a country like Spain, but overall in Europe and if you like, I mean, high-income regions, world regions, there are significant issues surrounding the access to the energy supply. And I believe this is a significant blind spot, not only in policies, definitely in policies, but also in the way we speak, we discuss energy poverty, and also the way we do research about energy poverty. So if we take in as a point of departure these three tenets of energy justice, the fact that we are sort of forgetting, allow me to say this, about access-related forms of hidden energy poverty means that we are under-recognizing these issues or misrecognizing them in the sense that they're often discussed, I mean, not in this community, definitely, but on a sort of more broader societal level. Issues of access, precarious access, irregular, informal access to the energy supply is sometimes seen from a purely legal perspective. And so this is not only about the under-recognition of these issues, but also about the misrecognition of access-related energy poverty. Of course, if we are not properly identifying, measuring, discussing these forms of energy poverty, it's unlikely that there will be policies or some sort of redistributive action or support mechanisms for those households that struggle to be formally, regularly, legally connected to have a proper access to the energy supply. And likewise, and there's something I'm taking here from Manon's presentation, nothing about us without us. I hadn't heard that one. I really liked that sentence. So procedural justice. Precisely in Europe, because the sort of the percentage, the share of the population affected by this type of severe energy poverty related to inadequate or precarious access to energy, well, though they are not being able to participate in policymaking processes, right? Okay, what do I mean by these access-related forms of energy poverty? Because this is probably non-comprehensive, but large enough taxonomy of typologies. I mean, we have households that are under consuming energy, and these are already captured by the so-called hidden energy poverty, or what the EPA calls low absolute energy expenditure indicators. So households that have very low energy expenditure, they are voluntarily, and this goes very much in italics or in quotation marks, self-rationing their energy use as an adaptive strategy that is very much motivated by affordability constraint. So it's not that they are disconnected, they don't have access, but their very low energy use, it is in a way preventing proper access to the supply. Or even in some cases, they voluntarily, and again in italics, terminate their energy supply contract. It would happen, for instance, if they have an electricity and natural gas supply contract, they will stay only with the electricity supply contract to reduce their costs. That's another access-related element that is worth considering. There is, of course, all the prepayment meters, but also other forms of prepaid energy. Anna was speaking about, Anna Bayomi was speaking about solid fuels in Latin, I mean, all over Europe, but especially in Central Eastern Europe, is a very important energy carrier. So anything that you have to pay in advance, any sort of energy that you need to pay in advance, makes access dependent on your disposable income. This includes prepayment meters, but also solid and liquid fuels. Of course, you have the supply disconnections following non-payment or late payment, and debt accumulations with suppliers, with sort of the issue that is best recognized and understood as an access-related form of energy poverty in Europe. But then you have other experiences, which is, for instance, these rural areas poorly served with not properly functioning distribution networks. I mean, I'm talking about electricity mostly here, or marginalized urban neighborhood. We have a few examples here in Spain, where the distribution network is in poor conditions. There are sort of illegal activities happening in those neighborhoods, mostly marijuana plantations, that create a very complex sort of scenario in which people are effectively facing recurrent blackouts and unstable electricity supply. Then you have the whole sort of sub sphere of informal or irregular connections to network energy supplies, natural gas and electricity, of happening mostly or very often after disconnections caused by non-payment, late payment, or due to informal housing arrangements. And then you have whole informal settlements that are have been collectively disconnected, or have no access or very insecure, inadequate access to the supply. And I'll give you an example from Spain. Okay, speaking of, I'll talk about three of those to provide some evidence. So supply disconnections, even though they are like well recognized, and that's a very clear issue on what we're talking about here. There is little statistical data on these matters. I mean, we have some proxy variables, which is arrears on utility bills, which is imperfect. Of course, those that are in arrears on utility bills some of those will eventually be disconnected. But there are no proper indicators, not even the microdata of the survey income and living conditions typically doesn't give you any information about this. I mean, there's a bit of an exception in the Spanish survey income and living conditions, but only for a few years, 4 years. There was this item here. I have it in Spanish, but you can see the translation here in English. So it's about, it was a very well posed question. It was about asking households whether they had they ceased to have access to one of their usual energy sources due to financial difficulties. And this question was encompassing both having been disconnected after late payment, debt accumulation, but also not being able to buy that type of fuel. That applies very much to those prepaid forms of energy, such as liquid fuels or solid fuels. And what we saw in the Spanish case is that around from 1 to 2% of the Spanish population of Spanish households declared having experienced this form of energy poverty according to this item, to this question. then you would say it's not much, right? It's 1 to 2%. Of course, it's statistically speaking, it's a very minor thing. But if you look at the aggregate numbers, then the picture changes slightly, right? Because we're talking about 500 to 1 million, to almost 1 million people, which is lots of people experiencing the very severe forms of energy deprivation. And not having electricity at home is a very serious issue, energy poverty wise. So I mean, at least we have some numbers that speak of these sort of under-recognized and misrecognized realities, right? But to be honest, I mean, I haven't done a systematic assessment of data sources about these connections in Europe. But to the little that I have explored the issue, I have the impression that there's nothing much better than this. There are probably some national surveys in which we can find similar data, but in any case, it's not systematically considered by monitoring frameworks, and therefore under-recognized. Speaking of a second typology of access-related forms of energy poverty, can show you a bit the case. I mean, this is ongoing research in Hungary about prepayment meters that I was conducted with colleagues with Hungarian colleagues that effectively they were the ones doing the interview with more than 20 households and number of stakeholders on the issue. This is one of our study locations. If you have never seen or you wonder how an informal connection to the electricity looks like, this is an example of it. So it's just these cables running along their path. This is a segregated Roma settlement in the town of Bag, nearby Budapest in the Pest county. So a very sort of materially and socially marginalized location. As you can see in the background, those houses do not look in great shape. And this is typically one of the ways in which some households end up having a prepayment meter when they have connected illegally, informally to the supply. Then the supplier will only reconnect them if they agree to have a prepayment meter. So they then run into debt subsequently. What you find to the right is how a prepayment meter looks like. I mean, this is a modern sort of version in which you have these cards that you have to top up, and then you pay in advance before you can use the energy. So very briefly, what we see in our qualitative evidence collected in Hungary is that, and I must say that it came a bit of a surprise because I had very negative, speaking about biases. My starting bias when I started doing research on this topic, I thought that most households would dislike prepayment meters, but the reality that we found is very different. They like it in general because that it means a secure access to the supply. It means that they will not run into debt and they will avoid these connections. But then they also acknowledge that these prepayment devices create new states of energy insecurity in the sense that they have to self-manage their precarity. It's up to them to decide how to use electricity, and they sometimes use it and natural gas. But it's mostly prepayment meters in here are mostly for electricity. How they very carefully use energy at home to avoid running out of credit in the prepayment meters. And our analysis, as I said, this is still ongoing research, indicates that prepayment meters may be contributing to segregate the sort of the Hungarian society into a two-tier provision energy system in which this prepayment meter, but also solid fuel users, and Nabayome was talking about that, they have some sort of second-class status, that they have worse supply access conditions, and also they receive less support from the states, the Rezsicsökkentés, the cost reduction program that Anna Stoilovska was referring to, has doesn't apply to solid fuel users and to what extent at the end to prepayment users as well. And we also feel that looking at the data, especially household interview transcript from stakeholders, that there is the installation of these prepayment devices, which is supported by some non-governmental organizations, charity organizations. It seems to follow to have an embedded disciplinary rationale, which is about disciplining and even sort of a reformatory purpose to bring back this underclass of unreliable energy consumers to acceptable economic and social behavior. So there's even a moral element in these devices. Okay, then we have this third typology of access-related energy poverty, which has to do with informal settlements. What you see here is the Cañada Real informal settlement, which is just outside the city of Madrid proper. It's sort of funny shape, sort of a funny shape informal settlement in the sense that it's a very long. Oh, you can see in this figure to the right. It's a long linear, 14 kilometers long informal settlement that is sort of preventing or clashing with the ongoing urban developments that are shown in red to the south and east of the city of Madrid. Madrid is a city that is growing in population, but also in extension. So all these urban developments, they are clashing against this informal settlement along an old cattle road. It's a long story, but what happened is that in October 2020, the company that owns and manages the electricity distribution network to which this settlement is informally connected, they implemented some technical changes, that's how they called it, which effectively meant that from one day to the next, 4,000 people lost access to the electricity supply in this southern tip, the southern half of the settlement. What is called Sector 6, so the most the southernmost part of the settlement, they're still without electricity as of today. I visited it 1 month ago, and I can tell you this is still without electricity. It's over 2,000 people and hundreds of children. Whereas in Sector 5, which is a bit north of Sector 6, what people do is they deal with the self-organized partial disconnections, especially in summer and winter, and that's how they manage to avoid the disconnections. What the Cañada tells us is that we've seen conditions that were already described by the literature as extreme energy poverty. Actually, in cases of Israel and Roma, I mean, Bedouin villages in Israel and Roma communities in Romania by colleagues of the Engager Cost Action Network. And they tell, well, this is not about being cold at home or anything like that. It's about even like the infrastructure is there, the distribution network is there, the grid is there, but we cannot access it for due to factors that do not have to do anything with poor energy efficiency, energy prices, and low income. So there are these urban scale drivers of energy poverty, which is informal housing, and the sort of the relative position of the informal settlement in relation to these ongoing urban developments. And there are also elements of social, spatial, ethnic segregation in the sense that in this informal settlement, there are lots of Roma population and population with a migrant background, mostly Moroccans and Romanians, Roma from Romania, they live there. So there's an element of urban social, spatial, social segregation in there as well. This is how it looks like. So in the background, you can see the district of Vallecas, this properly, that's Madrid proper, that's where sort of the formal legal connections of electricity happen, and this is how Cañada Real looks like at the start of a winter night. So this is an urban art intervention, street art intervention by street art collective Boa Mistura. So what they wrote with candles, nos están apagando, they're switching us off in order to raise awareness about the issue. It was a few years ago, but the conditions in the settlement remain like that. This is sector 6, where they are fully disconnected. So we see in Cañada Real is this very, I mean, we've collected in this article evidence of severe deterioration in material and living conditions, very poor indoor thermal comfort. I mean, it varies from household to household because not everyone is with the same poor, or not all houses in Cañada Real are in very poor conditions. But we definitely saw through sensor-based temperature measurements very poor indoor thermal comfort, and definitely lots of solid fuels and liquid fuels in what has been called energy degradation, so that is going down the energy ladder. The Cañada Real case also highlights that access-related forms of energy poverty have to do with housing, and specifically legal tenure, and proper legal access to housing is very important element to explain these forms of disconnection or precarious access. And what we see with the Cañada Real case is that all sorts of provisions. I mean, there's lots of energy poverty policies and support instruments in Spain nowadays. None of those apply to Cañada Real residents because they are non-compliant customers. Since they do not have proper any sort of proper supply contract. I mean, legal supply contract, they cannot benefit from the social bonus, rebates in tariffs, and other disconnection protection provisions that apply to all other vulnerable consumers in Spain, despite them being in a very vulnerable position. And we also see that this is, I mean, a subtypology of this community-wide disconnections in informal settlements. It happens in other neighborhoods in Europe, probably in Central Eastern Europe, in Roma neighborhoods. This has to be happening again. And what it does is these challenges, these sort of realities that are very statistically very rare, but qualitatively very salient. They challenge this global north affordability focused conceptualizations of energy poverty that are built around assumptions of universal and legal access to energy. And they sort of bring forward this notion of infrastructural exclusion as a probably relevant analytical framework. Okay, just to conclude. Despite sort of previous, I mean, with a substantial amount of previous research, I believe that we still see this persistent binary still working, in which global north energy poverty is about the energy affordability and global south is about energy access. There still sort of shapes and biases our understandings of energy poverty, in the sense that we still under-recognize and misrecognized these access-related forms of energy poverty in Europe. We know that they exist. Lots of people, an unknown amount of people, but it's probably in the range of millions of people, suffer from some sort of precarious or lack of access to the energy supply in Europe. And it is true that the affordability related energy poverty is what dominates quantitatively. But then we need to understand that precarious access to energy is quantitatively important because of the severity of the impacts on the affected population. It's a very severe form of energy poverty. And we have seen that there are various typologies of these forms of energy poverty. Just as I mean, I would only hint at some relevant policy steps in this directive that was released in 2024 on the electricity markets, in which it explicitly, and to my knowledge, I think it's the first time an EU directive dealing with energy poverty explicitly mentioned disconnections, protection from disconnections, as a policy priority. It only mentions disconnections in the sense that there are other realities around access-related energy poverty that are not that has again left out of. But nevertheless, I think it's relevant policy steps that needs to be acknowledged and understood how it works in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sergio. We're a little bit tight on time, but I see also there are no questions at the moment in the chat. I will also expect maybe there will something else coming up. I will quickly move to the last speaker in order to leave at least 10 minutes for questions. So the last speaker is Shivani Varal. I hope I used the right accent. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Economic and Social Research Institute. She has a quite long quote. Sorry. Sorry. But let's read it all. So when I think of the importance of energy justice, I am reminded of the former UN Secretary General's quote on poverty. Poverty is not a personal failure, it is a systems failure. It is this system that allows some to own multiple homes while others are homeless, and that same system permits some large inefficient properties to be heated, while the cost, higher bills, pollution, climate impact are borne by those of lower and end of the economic spectrum. So without energy justice, this balance cannot be achieved, and without it, the burdens of our energy system will fall disproportionately on those least able to bear it. Also very heavy of concept sentence. So I'm very curious that you will guide us on the energy prices shock and policy gaps. And I leave the floor to you, Shivani, for sharing your presentation. Please, considering that we are tight in time, people, if you already have questions, to start putting it in the chat so we can see how many there are and balance the timing at the end.
Are people able to see my screen?
We
Can
can
people
see and
hear
hear
me?
properly.
Ah, perfect. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Dora, and thank you, Lynn, for inviting me to the Global Economic Justice Action Week series. This is my first time attending this series as well as presenting, and I'm new to the field of energy justice, but I mean, listening to the past three days of presentation, I'm just very, very humbled to be presenting alongside the people whose work has really informed this work, as well as my knowledge on energy justice. So the paper that I'm presenting today is a co-authored work with Miguel, who is also a research officer at ESRI, and we look at the energy price shocks and policy gaps, and we, as opposed to the rest of the presentation today, it is more an EU level study. And this work has been funded by the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. So to motivate, I mean, for this group, I don't believe the motivation is really needed, but nevertheless, and everyone is aware with this price gap, which captures the general price trend for households that have been in the past, decades, and specifically focusing on the last 4 years of energy price rises in electricity and in gases to the EU level households, and what this has meant on EU level impact. It's just the population that are unable to afford adequate heating. As we can see, it's still at a very significant percentage of 9.2%, which I believe in one of the presentation was mentioned. It's in millions, So, and in Ireland, Ireland level impact is that the household with utility bill arrears, they are also very high during this time period, and both of these, jointly these indicators stress the effect it has on households due to these energy price rise. And this is the phenomenon of energy poverty and insecurity. I'm very aware of which term to use given the discussions, so I've used them both. And it's widely established in the research that there are 3 interconnected root causes that cause the energy price, this energy poverty phenomena to occur, and it usually relates to the high energy expenditure driven by the high energy prices, the poor energy efficiency of the dwellings, as well as the insufficient disposable income. So the consequences of this are quite dire, and it has already been talked about, or at least has been reflected in various presenters' conversation today, that it presents hardships for those that are at the lower end of the economic spectrum. And we have seen news articles which shows that households have been having to endure between whether to heat or to eat. And this is an article that was in 2023. This is an article that's in 2025, October, just last month, last month. And this shows how the the persistence of the issue is there. And I'm reminded that we have been talking about the issue of energy poverty, and we have been talking a lot about heating related cost. And the focus that I hope I would present here is towards that, how it also affects on households a bundle, like how it affects on other areas of essential goods as well when the energy price rises. So, and what it does is it also increases households' reliance on unsafe fuels. They are forced to burn trash, rubbish. And there were news articles that said that households were willing to burn anything to keep themselves warm. And not only that, it has, impact on our broader society, broad goals of, achieving net zero targets, as well as the sustainable development goals of eliminating poverty, making sure energy is affordable and clean, access to clean and affordable energy, as well as climate action. So, and in this context, people have already mentioned about the different European policies, different policies taken at the European national governments have taken to shield consumers around this time of energy crisis. But most of the prices, most of them were price-related measures, like trying to have a price cap, or you reduce the VATs on the energy prices. And there were some cash transfers, some vouchers. However, most of the spending went into broad measures, and they were untargeted rather than targeted supports. And although it's a little bit older reference, but when I read this article, it reminded me of, like, for people who are choosing between heating and eating, having a price cap, although it shields them from the bigger shock, but something just because it's fair does not mean it's affordable. So this was something that when I read, it really resonated strongly. And so in this context, this paper, what we do was we look at how these different policy interventions that took place during the energy price crisis, how did it affect households' behavior, their overall welfare, in terms of what it meant for households, in terms of their purchasing power, in terms of their consumption bundle, how did it affect other essential goods, and there's fewer quantitative assessment of all this distributional impact, what it meant for lower income household versus higher income household at like EU level. And that's what we work on. So to reiterate, we quantify this impact of energy price rise on households' budget, specifically focusing on low income households. And we use demand elasticity. So we capture how households spend on different bundles of goods and use that elasticity, like the demand responsiveness, to see energy price shocks, how it affected. And mostly we focus on the behavioral response, like quantitative assessment of behavioral response, specifically focusing on essentials and food. And we also look at what were the effects of this in terms of energy poverty levels, whether the energy price shock in policy interventions, how did it do in terms of EU countries, like energy poverty levels, the carbon emissions, and overall household well-being. So the methodology that we used is the exact Feinstein index. It's a demand system. So what it does, it just models how different households allocate budgets across different goods, such as food, education, transport, and it has a budget share it has an equation of a budget share which captures budget share for each of these commodities. And so if there's a price shift in one commodity, how does it affect the demand for the other? So what this approach allows us is it allows us to put in prices, income, expenditure. It allows us to incorporate different preferences. Not all demands are just only driven by price and income. There's different preferences, tastes that also can be incorporated, so we can capture both substitution and income effects. And we also, what we do is we use this elasticities, and then for the price shock period, we microsimulate what is the impact of this energy price hikes on overall household welfare and energy poverty headcounts. And I'm very aware that I'm using the low income high cost measure, which receives Sergio is in the chat, and so it has received criticism. But because we did it at EU level and to allow cross comparison, it was the objective indicator for the purpose of our study. But I acknowledge its cons. That's what I wanted to say. So in terms of the data sources, we use household level microdata, especially the EU household budget survey. It's for those who are new to it. It's a representative microdata which has detailed disaggregated spending data and rent, mortgage, energy, gas, everything you can think a household can spend on, and also information on income as well as the demographics. And in our study, we only covered 26 EU member states. We exclude Greece due to data inconsistency. And the waves that we cover for the demand system calculations are 3 waves of 2010, 2015, and 2020. And for the prices data, we use the Eurostat's harmonized index of consumer prices, so that all the different categories we have on our budget from the household budget surveys disaggregate spending, like expenditure categories, we have the corresponding prices. And for the microsimulation, we collected data from different national and European sources. And for the emission factors, we used different sources once again to make sure we can convert the energy energy expenditures into quantities, and then quantities into the emissions at household level. So let's go to the main thing. Sorry, I've got too technical. So it's now at the results. So this is one of our first results. And the first result that I present here in the graph is a heat map of the cross price elasticity. We chose one from the different ones from our paper, and this one is specifically focuses on the energy and food. And you can see like it's stratified by different income, and there's a clear difference in the spending pattern for the lower income versus the higher income household. And if you're able to see the tiny little box that shows the negative numbers, that is for the here for the households that are more have the lighter shade, you have the negative cross price elasticity. And what this means is that lower income households are cutting their food consumptions when energy price cost is rising. And this is a phenomenon that has been reinforced already in literature. And I've seen people who actually I've quoted here in their work, seen them present in the seminar. So it reinforces this phenomenon more EU level. So this is our first result. The second result is from the microsimulation bit. So this shows the welfare loss that the households endured around this 2020 to 2023 time period. And the welfare loss, it is composed of two metrics. It first captures the loss in the amount of commodities a household could afford due to the energy price shock, and the other was their limitation in substituting for their energy demand. And so what we see is that in 2022, like the blue graph, it's increased across most countries, but only a few countries that had really high managed to curb it a little bit. And among those few countries that managed to curb it, I think someone also mentioning like the cost in Denmark. So then similarly, it's a good affirmation that in our study also we find like for Belgium, Denmark, Ireland, Luxembourg, they had the highest rise, and then they were the ones with the policy interventions that they managed to curb the cost of living, total cost of living expenses due to energy price. However, when you look at the story now between income poor and non-income poor, you realize that the total cost of living expenses is higher on average for the income poor households rather than for the non-income poor, except for a few countries. And this shows that the income poor households were the one that suffered the larger relative loss due to the energy price hike than the income poor households. So the third result that we looked at was what did it do in terms of the emissions. So this graph, like there's two graphs, one for the non-poor and one for the poor households. For the non-poor households, and in both graphs, we have a baseline 2020 figure, and then we have 2022 and 2023. So first, there's a baseline, and you see in general that the 2022, the CO2 emissions on average for households, it decreases. But this could also be due to the high cost of living then, and also the reduction in consumption of energy, so which drove the emissions down. And in 2023, the light blue one, we see that the interventions, all the policies that helped to curb the energy prices after they had taken place, we see that the emissions level again rose. Then this makes us think that, well, the emissions policies, the energy policies did help to curb the total cost of living in the earlier graph. But then here we are seeing in terms of emission, it actually rose. And when you compare it for non-poor households and poor households, the emissions are higher from the non-poor households, reminding that they are the larger contributor or more emitter of the carbon emissions than the poor households because of the reduction in their consumption. And so specifically for those countries that had that really high cost of living effect due to energy price, the difference is not that different between the lower income and the higher income household, but for the others it's quite distinct. And this is the other graph, and this is the other result, is that we looked at what it meant in terms of energy poverty headcounts. So once again, we see across all countries energy poverty headcounts rose. So the cost of living measures, the energy price policy interventions that happened around that time period, 2020-2023, it curved slightly the total cost of living, but we don't see much difference, in reduction in the energy poverty levels. Once again, using the LIHC measure, so it's very much based on the measure too. Just want to acknowledge that. So overall, the policies that were put in place, they seem to be regressive because they have trade-offs. They are curbing something, but kind of exacerbating the issue in the other area, whereas it's the lower income households that are the ones that are still continue to be affected. The energy poor households still continue to be affected despite the policy interventions. And we also looked at, regardless of the, like the wealth and national structure, who are the households that continue to be vulnerable in this change in the energy poverty headcounts. And it's the classic ones that, has been identified in the literature as a woman, single parent, single person, those that don't have economic activity, that are economically inactive. And this also includes people with disability, people carers, so the unemployed residents, and especially those that are located in sparsely populated areas. So based on everything I discussed, so what are the key takeaways? That energy price shocks strained a lot of households' budgets, and it was the lower income households that bore the most relative burden. And how did they adapt to this energy price shock? They cut, not only they reduced their energy, they also reduced other essential needs as well, such as food, like transport. And in terms of the welfare and the distributional impact, we see that the policy, the energy price policy intervention, helped to curb down some of the cost of the living measures. However, it didn't really help curve down the energy poverty levels. I realized I didn't show a 2022 graph to kind of show that difference, but it was not too great. And in terms of the emissions, the policy helped. There was an initial reduction in the CO2 emissions level, but then it rose, so showing the pitfalls in the policy. And at the same time, higher income households were the one that mostly benefited from those measures rather than the lower income households. So overall, it exposed gaps in social production and affordability and climate resilience, and something that has been already resonated multiple times throughout the presentation in the last 3 days. So just hinting from our research, what we think could be future policy needs is like a targeted intervention. Broad policy measures were the one that allowed middle to higher income household to benefit whereas the lower income households still were bearing the most of the burden. And so it's need to be more targeted. And going with the European Commission's 2020 recommendation, energy poverty needs to be incorporated into the climate planning, and emergency relief alone would not be sufficient when something like this crisis happens again. And the other aspect is when you look at it at EU level, you realize that there's so much uneven impact across different member states, while a couple of member states are highly much affected than the others. So if there was more unified response, stronger response, that helps, so that not every EU member has to reinvent the wheel. So yeah, and also a need for differentiated climate policies, because we realize that while it helped the overall affordability measures, it helped to increase the carbon emissions level. So I hope I'm right on time. So thank you very much. That sums it up.
Perfect on time. Thank you very much. I move quickly to the fact that there are some questions on the chat. We have a few minutes. So the first question is for Hannah. Is there any shared common characteristic between the group of winter energy poverty and summer energy poverty? So if people reported cold, were they likely to report hot as well? For example, regarding the workspace?
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, yes, we did a little bit of a cross tabulation, and there was a significant and strong relationship between being cold at work and being too hot at work, which actually kind of probably says that it's a problem of the energy efficiency of the places where they were working. And there was also a strong relationship between being hot and cold at work, and also in the public transport, and also at home. So this is also kind of a more links to focuses on the people of these who are at the same time have this thermal discomfort at home and kind of experiences at the work. So it's still work on progress, but it's more of a commonality either across space, so they work in the same place in any season, or the link is to the people who are actually experiencing this vulnerability.
Thank you for the clarification. I don't know if there are other questions. I don't see anything in the chat, but as we are at the end, you can also unmute yourself and directly ask to our speakers. Okay, there is one in the chat from Nives. Fascinating work, Shivani. It made me reflect once more on the importance of implementing policies mixes that combine structural intervention with more empowering people-centered approach. As you mentioned, effective targeting is essential, and that requires close collaboration with the local actors to identify the groups as they are the closest to citizens. Okay, Mortena question was a comment on harvesting the experiences of the people closest, as I think all our speakers did already in their research, considering how you presented from giving direct quotes or mentioning, as Sergio did, that they were there just 1 month ago. But I think you have the direct contact with them. Thank you, Niles. I know you're actively working on this topic too. Any other food for thought for our audience?
Dora, sorry, I think there was a question. Lynn posted a question for me.
Thank you.
Well, what is it? Sorry. Yes. In your opinion, how should the policy respond differently when the issue is not cost but access itself?
Okay. Very quickly, I mean, I realized that in my presentation, I may have given the impression that access and affordability are like two very separate things. And I was trying to push forward that argument, but the reality is that, especially in contexts like Europe, well, not only in Europe, these are inevitably related in the sense that access-related energy poverty derives from affordability constraints, domestic energy affordability constraints. So my response would be, first, those that are already in at energy poverty, say vulnerable consumers, according to EU legislation, we should avoid disconnections and those should be prioritized. I mean, some countries, there are specific provisions, consumer protections. Not everyone is immediately disconnected when they fail to pay utility bills on time, and some vulnerable consumers tend to be a bit more protected, but they are not entirely protected. Speaking from the experience in Spain, only vulnerable consumers that are households with children, people with disabilities, very low income, and they have a recognized vulnerable consumer status. They are protected against these connections, and those are just a few of all the energy poor in the country. And then you have this whole, which is much more complex. I mean, again, the numbers are very small, but the issues are much more complex, of informal connections and informal housing that are often combined. In this case, this is very political, of course, but speaking from a right to energy perspective, I think we should guarantee a minimum access to the supply. And there are some experiences, again, in Spain for water provision. In some municipalities in Catalonia, the social services, they allow people living in informal housing to have access to water supply through what they call social meters, so socially sort of sensitive water supply contracts. I believe this could be applied also to energy.
Thank you, Sergio. And yes, the disconnection that you noticed, it was quite new. I can tell you that it's also applied in the accession process. I had the pleasure to support Serbia in developing the energy poverty accession, and the non-disconnection was one of the key elements to introduce in order to have a chance to unite in Europe. I don't know if there is anything else. Otherwise, I go to the closure. We are 2 minutes late. Give me the chance to tell our audience that 2 days ago, as Energy Poverty Advisory Hub, we released the save the date for our European conference. That will be the 17-18 March in Athens. I'm leaving the link in the chat. Also to all the speakers, there is the open call to have a session proposal. And I think all that you presented will be very interesting to see in the conference too. But let's move to the end. So first of all, thank you to all our speakers, Anna, Manon, Anna, Sergio, and Shivani. They helped us having a better understanding of the global north and what is happening here, what it is below the surface, and also maybe to experience that sometimes we think we are avoiding some deep and complicated severe energy poverties, recognizing it more with the global south, but we still have these cases here in Europe. We still have people burning wood, we still have people not having access to energy and facing difficulties. So I think that the main point is that working together and try to analyze better and maybe collect more data, as Shivani was mentioning. It is also one thing that we experience at EPA. When we have to compare countries, we have to face the lack of data, and we are forced to go against our point to be comprehensive and overlap them, and we need to reduce it to a smaller amount of data that can give a glimpse, but it's not optimal to understand the different nuances of energy poverty in a context. So let's keep our mind open. Let's try to collect more information and put ourselves in the position of the people really affected by this phenomenon to truly develop equitable actions for them. We still have 2 days of the Global Energy Justice Action Week. Tomorrow, we will turn our attention to the Global South. So we will study the energy justice, focusing on colonial legacies and local agency. Very interesting. So the connection also between Global North and Global South. And then we will go to the final day that, of course, will focus on the future. So towards a just energy future, and we will work on policy narratives, activism, and solidarity. I hope that today Food for Thought will stay with you and move you forward. And thank you again for your time. Thank you, Lynn, for the amazing organizations, and for Manchester University always take the time to organize this week of discussions. Hopefully, I will see you again next year, but finger crossed. I don't know, Lynn, if you want to say something else.
Thank you, Dora.
Done.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you all for participating. And yeah, I think yeah, you did amazing closing remarks. So I don't have anything to say, but just yeah, tomorrow we'll focus on the global south as Dora mentioned. So I hope to see many of you there, and let's get in touch and take care and enjoy the rest of the day. I hope you enjoyed today's session as well. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
You.